Delaney Hartwell could still remember with perfect clarity the scent of the first night she stepped into Blackwood Manor. The sharp tang of industrial cleaner clinging to her rubber gloves, blending with the rich smell of expensive leather, and the faint trace of Cuban cigar smoke drifting through the air, the scent of a world she knew with absolute certainty she didn't belong to. 27 years in this life, and she had only ever known the smell of cheap bleach, of damp rented rooms, and of loneliness that clung like a mist that never lifted. That night, as she stood before the 4-meter-high iron gates of Blackwood Manor, a 20-room castle resting in silence within the forests outside Boston, she carried nothing more than an old backpack, a mop, and a heart that had learned to stop hoping a long time ago. She came here because she needed money. $23,000 in hospital bills hung over her like a death sentence, and this night cleaning job paid 3 times the usual rate with only one condition: don't look anyone in the eye, don't ask anything, and never step into the 3rd-floor library. Delaney agreed without hesitation, never knowing that within the next 7 days, her entire life would be overturned by a man whose name she had never even heard. Ronan Blackwood, 34 years old, the head of the most powerful Mafia empire in New England. For the past 20 years, Delaney had believed her parents died in a fire when she was 7 years old. No relatives, no inheritance, no one who came to claim her. She drifted through 11 foster homes, ran away at 16, lived homeless for 8 months beneath the bridges of Boston. But on the 5th night in Blackwood Manor, as she wiped down an antique oak table in the 2nd-floor corridor at 2 o'clock in the morning, a tall figure suddenly emerged from the darkness. Her gray-blue eyes met his, deep blue like a storm-heavy ocean at night. She saw the glass of whiskey in his hand tremble, heard the faint crack of crystal under the pressure of his grip, and in a voice rough as though it had been waiting for this question for years, Ronan Blackwood spoke. "What is your name?" When the 3 syllables Delaney Hartwell left her lips, she had no idea that the worn silver bracelet on her wrist, the only thing her mother had left her with the faintly engraved initials I.H., was silently telling a story that too many people had already died for. She didn't know that the fire all those years ago hadn't been an accident. She didn't know that on the 3rd floor of this mansion, there was a room locked for 20 years, its walls covered with photographs of her. And she didn't know that the cold man standing before her had once sworn at his father's grave that he would find her no matter what, to fulfill a blood-bound promise carved across 2 decades. If Delaney's story is drawing you in, don't forget to press subscribe and like so you won't miss what comes next. Share this video with friends who love mystery, because they might be waiting for a story just like this. And now, let's return to Blackwood Manor, where Delaney is about to step into the night, when everything she believes about her life begins to fall apart. After Ronan Blackwood spoke that fateful question, the tall man suddenly turned away, his footsteps striking the marble floor and echoing through the silent night like the sound of something breaking beyond repair. Delaney stood frozen in the vast hallway, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, her heart pounding so wildly she could hear every beat against her chest. She didn't understand what had just happened. She only knew that the man's eyes, dark blue like a storm-filled ocean at night, had looked at her in a way no one ever had in her 27 years, a gaze woven with pain, recognition, and something dangerously close to relief. She stood there for about 5 minutes, unable to move, until the old clock in the hallway struck 3 o'clock in the morning and pulled her back into the present. Delaney hurriedly gathered her tools, pushed the cleaning cart down the back stairs, and walked so fast it was almost running. When she reached the iron gate, a man in a black suit was already waiting. Tall, rigid, his face carved from stone, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. He didn't introduce himself. He only said in a low voice that this was a reward from the master, then turned and left without waiting for a response. Delaney held the envelope, feeling its unusual weight, and her heart began to race again for an entirely different reason. The old yellow taxi carried her through the empty streets of Boston at dawn, the dim streetlights casting her reflection against the window, and she couldn't take her eyes off the envelope resting on her lap. When she reached her small apartment in the working-class district of the South Side, where the familiar smell of dampness greeted her like an old companion, she sat on the worn sofa, opened the envelope, and drew in a long breath. Inside was $3,000 in cash, 3 times what she earned in an entire exhausting week. Her hands began to tremble, not from joy, but from a quiet instinct that this money wasn't gratitude. It was an invitation into something she couldn't yet name. She looked around her tiny room, at the old wooden bookshelf, at the faded photograph of Eleanor, the woman who had once cared for her when she was 10 before dying of cancer, and she felt that familiar emptiness rising inside her chest. That night, Delaney couldn't sleep. She lay restless on the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling that looked like a map leading nowhere, something she had known all her lonely years. In the fragile sleep that came and went, she began to dream strange dreams she had never known before. A gentle melody she didn't recognize yet felt belonged to her like blood. Large, warm hands lifting her out of darkness and noise. A soft woman's voice calling her name again and again. "Delaney, my little Delaney." And she woke in the middle of the night with tears on her face without knowing why. At 7 o'clock the next morning, just after she finished making a strong cup of black coffee, her phone rang. It was Petra Kowalski, the 45-year-old Polish woman who managed the cleaning company where she worked, the only person who had ever stood up for her in the past 3 months. Petra's voice sounded unusually tense, telling her to come to the office immediately. When Delaney stepped into the small office filled with the scent of Turkish coffee, Petra was already waiting, holding a thick file, her face serious. She asked Delaney to sit, pushed the file toward her, and said slowly that there was a very special request from Blackwood Manor, that they wanted to promote her to become the personal housekeeper for the entire second floor, with a salary 5 times higher and full benefits included. Delaney looked up, unable to believe what she had heard. 5 times. More than $20,000 a month. Enough to pay off her hospital debts in 2 months. Enough to leave the damp apartment. Enough to finally see a future not buried under fear. But Petra didn't smile. She stood, walked around the desk, placed a warm hand on Delaney's shoulder, and lowered her voice with a worry Delaney had rarely seen in her, saying she didn't know what Delaney had done to attract Mr. Blackwood's attention so quickly that in 15 years no employee had ever been personally selected for promotion by the master, and she warned her to be careful with every step, every word, because the world of men like Ronan Blackwood was not a world people like them could enter and leave unchanged. Delaney listened, torn between the chance to escape poverty and a quiet fear she couldn't name. And when she signed the contract, her trembling hand didn't know it had just pushed open the door to a truth about her family that would change everything. The second night at Blackwood Manor began when the antique clock in the main hall struck 9 o'clock in the evening, and Delaney stepped through the iron gate carrying a completely different state of mind from the night before. This time, she wasn't wearing the cleaning company uniform. Instead, she wore a crisp white shirt and black trousers Petra had given her that morning, along with a heavy ring of 12 keys, each one opening a different room on the second floor of the mansion. An internal manager named Vanessa Lindgren, a thin woman in her 50s, with short blonde hair and sharp eyes, led her through each room in exactly 40 minutes, explaining which rooms needed daily cleaning, which only required dusting once a week, and which must never have anything touched on their desks. When Vanessa left, Delaney stood alone in the long second-floor hallway, with the unsettling feeling that the entire house was quietly watching her every step. She began her work in the first room, moving slowly and carefully, her rough hands gliding over furniture whose value far exceeded anything she had ever owned. Around 11 o'clock, while cleaning the staircase leading to the third floor to replace a wilted flower vase, Delaney suddenly saw him. A man around 62 years old, tall and slender, his silver hair combed neatly back, dressed in a simple gray suit without a tie, standing silently at the end of the third-floor hallway before a dark carved oak door. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply stood there with his hands behind his back, like a statue that had occupied that place for decades. But when his eyes met Delaney's, something stirred within her chest. Those gentle brown eyes carried a deep sorrow that made her heart tighten, yet at the same time held a softness like an uncle seeing a long-lost niece return home. His lips parted as if to speak. His chest rose slightly as if gathering breath. But then he closed his mouth, gave her a small polite nod, and turned away. Delaney stood frozen, nearly dropping the vase in her hand. She didn't know who he was, but something in his eyes made her want to follow him and ask. Yet the discipline she had learned from years in foster homes told her not to be curious about what didn't belong to her, and she quietly returned to her work. Later she would learn his name was Arthur Whitmore. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Delaney was assigned to clean Ronan's study, the only room on the second floor with a large window overlooking the back garden. The room carried the familiar scent of Cuban cigars, with a large ebony desk and towering shelves filled with old leather-bound books. As she dusted the desk, she gently pulled open a small drawer to clean inside. and her hand brushed against something solid. A small old silver photo frame slipped out and fell onto the carpet with a soft sound. Delaney quickly bent down to pick it up, her heart racing, afraid she had damaged something valuable. But when she turned it over, her breath caught. The aged black and white photograph showed two young men standing together in front of an Irish restaurant, with a wooden sign above the door. Both wore white shirts and dark trousers, both smiling brightly, with arms draped over each other's shoulders like brothers. The man on the right she recognized from the large oil portrait in the main hall, Finian Blackwood, Ronan's father. But it was the man on the left who held her gaze. He had gray-blue eyes exactly like hers, a face that resembled hers in a way that was almost unsettling, and a slight crooked smile identical to the one she saw in the mirror each morning. Delaney turned the photo over, and her hand began to tremble as she read the faded blue ink. Declan and Finian, brothers forever, 1998. Declan. The name struck her like lightning. She had heard it before, not in real life, but in a strange dream the night before, when a gentle female voice had whispered it in the darkness. Delaney stood frozen, the photograph trembling in her hand, her mind flooded with questions all at once. Why did this man have eyes like hers? Why had the name Declan appeared in her dream? Why had Finian Blackwood, the most powerful man in New England decades ago, called him brother? But before she could think further, she heard heavy footsteps approaching from the end of the hallway, steady and commanding, a sound she recognized instantly. Ronan Blackwood was coming. She quickly placed the photo back into the drawer, pushed it closed, and barely managed to grab her cleaning cloth when the study door opened. Delaney lowered her head, not daring to look up, her heart pounding, because she knew the secret she had just touched might change her entire life, and she didn't know whether that change would save her or destroy her. The third night at Blackwood Manor began in a silence so deep that Delaney found herself listening to every whisper of wind moving through the forest behind the mansion. After the night she discovered the photograph of Declan and Finian, she had spent the entire following day restless, unable to stop thinking about those gray-blue eyes in the faded black and white image that looked exactly like her own. When she entered the mansion that night, she carried a quiet determination to learn more about the name Declan, even if it meant finding only the smallest fragment of truth. Around 11 o'clock, Vanessa Lindgren assigned her to clean the second-floor library, a vast room in the west wing with tall walnut bookshelves reaching the ceiling and a large glass window overlooking the rose garden. Delaney worked in silence, her hands moving steadily across the old leather-bound books, but her mind remained fixed on the silver photo frame hidden in Ronan's drawer. Around midnight, as she wiped the large wooden table by the window, a sudden sound froze her in place. The sharp, urgent barking of a dog echoed from the garden below, filled with warning and tension. Nothing like the usual playful barking she had heard during the day when Kaiser chased pigeons. Delaney hurried to the window, pulled aside the heavy velvet curtain, and looked down. Under the yellow glow of the garden lights, she saw the large black dog standing at the edge of the forest, its fur raised, barking fiercely into the dense shadows between the pine trees. Her heart began to pound. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the thickening air that seemed to fill the room. Then, in an instant, the entire mansion fell into complete darkness. The lights went out all at once, without any alarm, leaving behind a strange, suffocating silence. Delaney stood frozen in the library, still holding the cleaning cloth, her eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. She heard footsteps running from somewhere below on the first floor, doors slamming, and a man shouting in a language she couldn't understand. Before she could decide what to do, the library door burst open with force, and the tall figure of Ronan Blackwood appeared in the doorway, faintly illuminated by moonlight. He didn't speak. He crossed the room in long strides and took her wrist in a firm grip, not painful, but impossible to resist. His voice was low and urgent, speaking only 5 words. "Come with me. Do not ask." Delaney was pulled through the darkness, her feet catching on the thick carpet, but his steady hand kept her upright. He led her to a bookshelf along the eastern wall, where a small bronze statue rested. He pulled it down slightly, and the entire bookshelf slid aside in silence, revealing a narrow, hidden passage leading downward. He pushed her forward, followed closely behind, and the wall closed again as soon as they stepped through. A spiral stone staircase led them deep underground, the air cool and damp. At the bottom, Ronan opened a thick steel door and guided her into a small but fully equipped room. Inside were soft leather chairs, a wooden table, a surveillance monitor running on backup power, and shelves stocked with bottled water and dry food. He gestured for her to sit, then stood in front of the monitor, his dark blue eyes tense as they followed the images on the screen. Delaney curled into the chair, clutching her knees, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it. Through the layers of concrete above, faint sounds still reached her. The crash of objects, hurried footsteps, distant shouts. She didn't know what was happening above, only that she was being protected by the man standing a few steps away from her. 15 minutes passed, like 15 hours. Then suddenly, all noise stopped. Ronan pressed a hand to the small earpiece at his collar, listened, and nodded. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw him clearly under the yellow light. His charcoal suit was disheveled, a button torn loose, his dark hair no longer neat, and a faint cut reddened across his cheek. He opened the steel door and stood before her, his voice calm in a way that almost felt unreal. "You are safe now. They have all been restrained." Delaney looked up at him, her gray-blue eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking into a fragile whisper. "They came for me, didn't they?" Ronan didn't answer right away. He only looked at her with a heavy, quiet pain in his eyes, the look of a man who had foreseen this moment long ago, yet could not escape the weight of it when it finally arrived. His silence was the clearest answer, and in that moment Delaney understood she had stepped into a world she could never walk away from again. Delaney did not sleep a single minute that night. After Ronan led her out of the safe basement and had Harlan Cole escort her back to her small apartment in the working-class district at 4 o'clock in the morning, she sat for 4 hours straight on the worn sofa, her eyes fixed on the faded curtain, her hand absent-mindedly turning the silver bracelet her mother had left her around her wrist. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard distant echoes of shouting in the night, saw the faint cut on Ronan's cheek under the yellow light in the underground room, and felt again the firm grip of his hand pulling her through the darkness, strong but never hurting her. The pieces in her mind came too fast, too overwhelming, and she knew that if she kept her head down in silence for even one more day, she would lose herself completely. At 8 o'clock that morning, she stood up, took a cold shower to clear her thoughts, put back on the white shirt from the night before that she had quickly washed, tied her hair neatly at the nape, and stepped outside to take a taxi back to Blackwood Manor. She did not call ahead, did not ask Petra for permission, did not think about the consequences if Ronan chose to send her away. For the first time in 27 years of her life, Delaney Hartwell was no longer the obedient girl who bowed her head to the world. She wanted answers, and she wanted them now. When the taxi stopped in front of the 4-meter-high iron gate, Harlan Cole was already there, as if he had expected her. He did not ask anything, only nodded once and opened the gate. Delaney walked along the stone path with a determination she had never known, knocked on Ronan's study door on the 2nd floor 3 firm times. When the door opened, she did not wait to be invited. She stepped in and stood straight in the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly before her, her gray-blue eyes burning with a fire she herself had never seen before. Ronan sat behind the ebony desk, wearing a white shirt without a tie, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing part of a black raven tattoo stretching across his left collarbone through the open neckline. In his hand was a glass of morning whiskey, which he turned slowly between his fingers. He showed no surprise when he saw her. He simply looked up, his dark blue eyes meeting hers, and waited. Delaney took a deep breath, and her voice came out clear and firm, without a trace of the trembling from the night before. "I have the right to know the truth, and I will not leave this room until I have it. Why is someone trying to harm me? Why was your security already prepared for an attack on the exact 3rd night I was here? Who are you to me, Ronan Blackwood? And most importantly, why did you know my name before those 3 syllables ever left my lips?" Ronan did not answer immediately. He set the glass down, his fingers still lightly turning its rim, his eyes resting on her with an expression she could not read. It was a mixture of respect, pain, and something close to relief, as if he had been waiting for this moment, for her to stand before him like this, for many years. The silence stretched for nearly a minute that felt like a lifetime to Delaney. Then Ronan slowly stood, walked past her, and moved to the eastern wall of books, where rows of old leather-bound volumes stood in perfect order. He reached out and pulled a thick, dark brown book, titled Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, from the shelf, and Delaney watched in astonishment as a section of the bookshelf, about 1 meter wide, slid aside without a sound, revealing a hidden metal compartment built into the wall. He unlocked it with a small key taken from his shirt pocket, and retrieved a rectangular brass-colored metal box about the size of a textbook. He turned back, placed the box on the ebony desk between them, and looked directly into her eyes. His voice was low and measured, each word chosen carefully, as if he had rehearsed this moment many times. "Sit down, Delaney. What I am about to show you and tell you will change everything you have ever believed about your life. You will need time to accept it, and I will give you that time." Delaney sat in the leather chair across from him, her hands resting on her lap, trembling slightly despite her effort to remain calm. Ronan opened the lid of the metal box. Inside, arranged carefully, was a stack of old photographs tied together with a faded blue silk ribbon, and beside it, a folded letter on yellowed paper, written in a handwriting that made Delaney's heart tighten the moment she saw it. Ronan untied the ribbon, lifted the top photograph, and slid it toward her. Delaney looked down at the image on the dark wood surface, and her entire world stopped. A 5-year-old girl with chestnut brown hair tied into 2 playful braids was laughing brightly while sitting on the shoulders of a man with kind eyes and a slightly crooked smile, surrounded by a birthday cake with 5 candles and pink balloons. That little girl was her. She could not mistake those clear gray-blue eyes. And the man holding her, smiling like sunlight itself, was the same man she had seen beside Ronan Blackwood in the black-and-white photograph the night before. Delaney turned the photograph over, and when her eyes read the faded black ink on the back, tears began to fall before she even realized she was crying. Taken by Ronan, Delaney's 5th birthday, 2003. Delaney still trembled as she held the photograph in her hands, silent tears falling onto the polished ebony surface of the desk, while Ronan Blackwood slowly lowered himself into the leather chair across from her. He didn't rush, and he didn't try to comfort her with empty words he knew would mean nothing. He waited for her breathing to steady, waited for those gray-blue eyes to lift and meet his with the readiness to face what was coming next. When Delaney finally set the photograph down and drew a deep breath to steady herself, Ronan began to speak in a low, even voice, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this story in his mind thousands of times over the past 6 years. He told her that his father, Ronan Blackwood, hadn't died of a heart attack as the newspapers had claimed 6 years ago. His father had been murdered by someone close to him, and before he died, he left behind a letter sealed with red wax bearing the raven crest of their family. Ronan remembered every word of that letter, though he had read it only once before burning it, as his father had wished. The letter gave him 3 instructions. First, he must find Delaney. Second, he must fulfill the promise his father had owed Declan for 20 years. And third, most important of all, he must only bring her into this world when he was certain he could protect her, because if he brought her too soon, he would lose her just as his father had lost Declan. Ronan paused, lifted his glass, and took a small sip of whiskey before continuing. For 6 years, he hadn't lived a single day without thinking about her. He hired 3 private investigators working separately to avoid leaks, receiving monthly reports on her life, along with photographs taken from a distance. He knew she had moved 17 times over 10 years, held 12 different jobs, from waitress to supermarket cashier, knew she had been fired from an Italian restaurant on Newberry Street the previous April because of a false accusation. He knew that 3 months ago she had been rushed into surgery for a ruptured appendix without insurance, leaving her with a debt of $23,000 and collection agencies calling her daily. When Ronan learned that, he could not wait any longer. He called Vanessa Lindgren into his study and ordered her to replace the cleaning company, giving specific instructions for the new contract. Vanessa, who had served the Blackwood family for 25 years, simply nodded without question. She contacted Petra Kowalski's company through an intermediary lawyer named Nathaniel Pritchard, under the pretense that Blackwood Manor was seeking a new service. Within that contract, a carefully hidden clause requested single female employees under 30, with clean records and no ties to media or law enforcement. Petra, reviewing her staff, identified Delaney Hartwell as the most suitable candidate, unaware that her name had already been mentioned weeks earlier. Ronan explained that he waited 2 weeks after Delaney began working before appearing before her, ensuring no enemies had discovered his plan. The night he finally met her in the hallway was not coincidence, but the moment he had waited 6 long years for. Delaney felt a chill run through her as she listened. She pushed her chair back abruptly, the sound echoing sharply against the shelves behind her, her hands clenched, her knuckles turning white, her voice breaking with anger and hurt as she spoke. So everything was arranged. The money, the promotion, the salary increase, all of it was you. You have been moving my life like a piece on your board for 6 years without me ever knowing." Ronan stood as well, stepping around the desk and stopping 2 steps away from her. Not closer, not retreating, meeting her anger without hesitation. His voice remained low, but carried a sincerity that made her heart falter despite herself. "No, Delaney, I didn't control you. I created an opportunity, a door for you to walk through. But the choice to step through it was always yours." He gestured toward the metal box on the desk. "Right now, if you want to leave, I will transfer $50,000 to you today. Enough to clear your debts and begin a new life anywhere you choose. I will not hold you here. I will not follow you again. I will respect your decision. But before you turn away from this room, I ask you one thing. Do you want to know who your parents truly were and why they had to pay with their lives so that you could exist in this world?" Delaney stood still, her breath uneven, her gray-blue eyes locked onto his dark blue gaze, and in that moment, stretched as long as a lifetime, she felt she was standing at a crossroads that would shape everything that remained of her life. Delaney stood still for several seconds that felt endless, her gray-blue eyes looking through Ronan as if she were staring into a distant past that had never truly belonged to her. Then she let out a long breath, her shoulders lowering, and slowly returned to sit in the leather chair across from him. She said nothing, only gave a slight nod, a silent gesture that carried her decision to stay, to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ronan nodded in return, then walked to the cabinet in the corner, poured a small glass of whiskey, and set it before her, along with a glass of water. He knew she didn't drink, but he placed it there in case she needed something to steady the storm inside her. Then he sat down, rested his arms on the desk, and began telling the story his father had told him hundreds of times since he was 12 years old. The story began in a poor working district in the north of Dublin in the year 1979. During a winter so cold that snow covered the rusted tin roofs and the blackened chimneys of textile factories, there, in an orphanage run by the Sisters of Mercy, 2 10-year-old boys slept on iron beds side by side. One had dark red hair, deep blue eyes, quiet and guarded, with a gaze sharp as a blade. That was Finian Blackwood. The other had chestnut brown hair, clear gray-blue eyes, gentle and brilliant to the point that the nuns were astonished whenever he solved complex problems from old newspapers. That was Delaney Hartwell. Finian lost his parents in a violent street conflict when he was 7. Declan had been left at the church door as a newborn, his name written on a small note tucked into his blanket. The 2 boys relied on each other for 10 years in the orphanage, sharing every piece of bread, protecting one another from bullies, and dreaming of escaping Dublin one day to find a new life in America. In the spring of 1989, when they had both turned 20, they boarded a cargo ship from Dublin with $7 in Finian's pocket, a few worn clothes in a bag, and a brotherhood vow carved with a small knife into the inside of 2 identical silver bracelets. The vow was only 6 words: brothers forever, never abandon each other. When they arrived at the port of Boston on a cold, fog-filled May morning, they had no idea what the future would bring, only that they had each other, and that was the most valuable thing 2 orphan boys from Dublin had ever possessed. 10 years later, Finian Blackwood had become a name that commanded caution across New England. He began as a dock worker, then moved into running small casinos, gradually building the Blackwood empire across major cities from Boston to Providence. But Finian held one iron rule he never broke. He never touched drugs, never harmed children, and never harmed the innocent. Declan chose a different path. With extraordinary mathematical talent and a nearly perfect memory, he graduated from Boston University with honors in accounting and finance, and became chief accountant for all of the family's legitimate businesses. He managed the books for Blackwood Residences, a chain of 4-star hotels with 23 locations along the East Coast, handled finances for 7 fine dining restaurants, bearing Finian's name in Boston and New York, and oversaw the entire commercial real estate portfolio of Blackwood Holdings. Declan kept a strict boundary from the darker side of the family. He never asked unnecessary questions, never touched suspicious accounts, and whenever Finian tried to discuss those matters, he would leave the room with a quiet smile and say, "That is your world. I only deal with clean numbers." Declan wanted to keep his soul untainted, not out of judgment toward Finian, but because he had promised himself that one day his child would grow up free from the shadows of the family, without carrying the burden of blood-stained secrets. Then, on an autumn afternoon in 1997, Declan met Isabel Hartwell at a charity event at the Copley Plaza Hotel. Isabel was 26 at the time, a rising investigative journalist for the Boston Tribune, with softly curled dark brown hair, clear gray-blue eyes, and a mind as sharp as a blade. She attended the event to write about Boston's elite, and she dared to confront Declan directly about the questionable origin of the funds behind the event. For the first time in his life, Declan encountered a woman who spoke to him with such fearless honesty, and he fell in love with her from that moment, a fierce and blinding love that led him to propose after only 8 months. Ronan paused, his eyes distant as if seeing the memories his father had once described. "Your mother was the bravest woman my father ever knew, Delaney, and it was that courage that ultimately led to the tragedy that took both your parents from you forever." Ronan paused for a long moment after those words, lifting his glass of whiskey and taking a full sip, as if he needed the burn of it to steady himself before continuing into the darkest part of the story. Delaney sat motionless in the chair, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her gray-blue eyes fixed on him without blinking, her heart braced for the next blow. Ronan set the glass down, drew in a deep breath, and began to speak of a name he had spent 6 years hating down to the marrow: Magnus Voss. Magnus Voss was the man his father had once regarded as a second brother, after Delaney Hartwell. He had joined the Blackwood family in 1991, at the age of 23, a young and ambitious bodyguard from Eastern Europe, with sharp intelligence, refined negotiation skills, and a loyalty that seemed unshakable. Magnus climbed through the ranks of the Blackwood system, and by the year 2000 he had become the underboss, the right-hand Finian trusted completely. For more than a decade, Magnus sat at the family table every Sunday, carried Ronan in his arms when he was a child, brought birthday gifts to Delaney each year when she was still a little girl in the Hartwell home, and bowed his head to Finian with a respect no one ever questioned. But beneath that surface of loyalty, a dark ambition had been growing, taking root and spreading like a weed no one could see. In the summer of 2003, when Delaney was 5 years old, Isabel Hartwell stumbled upon something unusual while working on an investigative series about organized crime at the Port of Boston. She was an independent investigative journalist, not employed by Blackwood, and her reputation was built on a fearless pursuit of dangerous leads. Isabel discovered a number of shipping containers registered under the name of Blackwood Residences, the chain managed by Declan, but the contents did not match the official records. When she quietly asked Declan about them, his face went pale, because he knew he had never approved such shipments. Husband and wife began to investigate in secret, and what they uncovered over the next 2 years chilled them to the core. Magnus Voss had built a large-scale drug trafficking network through the Boston port, using the legitimate logistics system of Blackwood Residences as a cover, forging Declan's signature through a bribed accountant, and laundering money through a network of shell companies scattered across the Cayman Islands. This violated every one of Finian's iron rules: no drugs, no harm to children, no harm to the innocent. If Finian had discovered it, Magnus would not only have been cast out of the family, he would have faced far worse consequences. For 2 years, Isabel and Declan gathered evidence in silence, photographing Magnus's secret meetings with Colombian traffickers, copying double-layered financial records, recording leaked phone calls, and compiling everything into a 170-page dossier hidden in a secure bank vault. They planned to present it to Finian on the night of Saturday, November 12, 2005, after Delaney's 7th birthday dinner, where the entire Blackwood family would be present. But Magnus had spies. One of the private investigators Declan had hired had already been bought, and Magnus learned of their plan 12 hours before the exchange was to take place. That night, just as Declan and Isabel finished sealing the evidence, a coordinated attack struck the Hartwell home in Beacon Hill. Finian, receiving a warning call from a loyal informant at exactly 11 o'clock that night, rushed to the scene with desperate speed. But when he arrived, the house was already destroyed, and he managed only to carry 7-year-old Delaney out alive in his arms. Her parents were not so fortunate. Ronan's voice grew hoarse as he continued. "The small crescent-shaped scar on your left wrist, that is the only mark left from that night, aside from your life itself. My father wanted to take you in immediately, that very night, to bring you to Blackwood Manor and raise you as his own daughter, but he could not. Magnus learned you were alive just 3 days later, and he sent a message to my father that if Delaney Hartwell appeared anywhere within the Blackwood world, he would erase you without hesitation, and there would be no Finian arriving in time a second time. To protect you, my father had to make the hardest decision of his life. He let you disappear into the state foster system, with records carefully altered by a loyal lawyer, your identity hidden, your past erased. But he never stopped watching you, Delaney, not for a single day. When Ronan finished his final sentence, the study fell into a heavy silence so deep that Delaney could hear the steady ticking of the antique pendulum clock in the hall beyond. Her tears had stopped, not because she had calmed, but because her body had been exhausted by the relentless storm of the past 45 minutes. She sat there with her hands resting on her lap, her head lowered, her slender shoulders trembling in small waves. Ronan said nothing more. He simply rose, walked around the desk, and placed a warm hand lightly on her shoulder for a single second before withdrawing. It was the only gesture he could offer her in that moment. Then he spoke softly, his voice gentler now, saying he wanted to take her somewhere his father had prepared for her for 20 years. Delaney lifted her head, her eyes still red, looking at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She nodded. Ronan took from the drawer of his desk an old brass key about 7 centimeters long, its head forged into the shape of a stylized raven. He closed his hand tightly around it, then spoke in a low voice. My father kept this key in his personal safe for 20 years, Delaney. Before he died, he gave it to me with one instruction. When she is ready, open that door and show her what I could not bring her to myself. Today is that day. He asked her to stand, and together they left the study, walked along the second-floor hallway, and climbed the white marble spiral staircase to the 3rd floor. At the end of the hallway, before the dark oak door she had seen 2 nights earlier, Arthur Whitmore was already waiting, his hands trembling, his eyes filled with tears. He looked at Delaney with that same gaze she had seen before, the gaze of a man who had waited half a lifetime for this moment. Ronan inserted the brass key into the old lock, turned it gently, and the door opened with a soft creak from hinges long unused. Delaney stepped across the threshold, and in that instant she felt as if her chest had been crushed, leaving her unable to breathe. The room was large, about 40 square meters, with a high ceiling, filled with morning light streaming through 2 tall windows draped with sheer white curtains. But what stole her breath was not the space, it was what covered the walls. Hundreds, no, thousands of photographs arranged carefully in chronological order, stretching from one wall to the other. All of them were of her, she at 8 years old, wearing an oversized red coat, standing uncertainly before her first foster home in Worcester. She at 9, sitting alone on a park bench with a book, her chestnut hair in 2 braids. She at 12, standing before Lincoln Middle School in Chelsea, her backpack too heavy for her thin frame. She at 14, wiping tables at a small laundromat where she worked after school to earn money for books. She at 16, reading Jane Eyre in Franklin Park, unaware she was being watched from behind oak trees. She at 18, stepping out of a state shelter with a worn cloth bag. She at 21, working as a waitress in a cheap restaurant on Dorchester Street. She at 24, standing outside the emergency room of Massachusetts General after her appendectomy. And she at 26, just last year, sitting alone in Boston Common on a cool autumn afternoon. At the center of the room stood a large wooden table, and on it rested a gold-plated brass frame. Delaney stepped closer, and when she saw the photograph inside, tears flooded her eyes again. It was her high school graduation, 7 years ago, wearing a navy gown she had rented for $25, sitting alone on a bench after everyone else had left. She had believed no one cared, no one had come for her. But here, in this room, the photograph was displayed in the finest place, as if someone had been there, had seen her, had been proud of her. Beside it sat a walnut box carved with a raven, waiting to be opened. At that moment, Arthur Whitmore entered, carrying a second box, larger, made of aged cherry wood polished by time. He set it down and looked at her, his lips trembling. Finian wrote to you every year on your birthday, for 13 years, from when you were 8 until he passed. He could never send them, for fear Magnus would find you, but he never missed a single year. Delaney sank to the wooden floor, her hands shaking as she opened the box, and as she lifted the first letter, she whispered through tears, "Who took all these photographs?" Ronan stood behind her, his voice rough with emotion. "My father, and after he was gone, I did." Delaney sat on the floor of that room filled with photographs for nearly 2 hours, reading each of the 13 letters Finian had written to her over the years, every letter a piece of a quiet love she had never known she possessed. Some letters told of how Finian had stood from a distance in the courtyard of her middle school, watching her receive a certificate of academic excellence. Others spoke of the time he had secretly sent money through a charity when he learned she could not afford books at 13. There was even a letter written through tears when he heard she had run away at 16, and how he had sent 3 men to search for her for 3 months. When she reached the final letter, written only 1 week before he passed, the handwriting trembling from illness, Delaney could no longer hold back her sobs. Ronan stood quietly by the window the entire time, his hands in his pockets, his eyes resting on the rose garden behind the mansion, giving her space to be alone with her past. Arthur Whitmore had long since slipped away, leaving her with 20 years of silent love from an uncle she had never known existed. When Delaney finally rose to her feet, her eyes still red but her heart strangely lighter, Ronan stepped closer and said softly that there was still one more place his father had wanted her to see, a place Finian had prepared for her since she was 12. Delaney looked at him, too drained to ask questions, and simply nodded as she followed him down the stairs. The black Rolls-Royce was already waiting at the gate, and Harlan Cole drove them quietly through Boston on a clear late autumn afternoon. Red maple leaves scattered across the streets of Back Bay. They stopped before a 40-story glass tower by the Charles River, with a black granite entrance and uniformed staff bowing as they recognized Ronan. He led her into a private elevator, inserted a special key into the panel, and it carried them directly to the top floor without stopping. When the doors opened, Delaney stepped into a private hallway leading to a single walnut door, marked with a small brass plaque engraved with the name Hartwell. Ronan unlocked it and motioned for her to enter first. As Delaney crossed the threshold, she couldn't breathe for several seconds. Before her stretched a vast 3-level penthouse, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the Charles River and the Boston skyline. The interior blended classical elegance with modern design, cream leather sofas, hand-woven Persian rugs, and oil paintings she recognized as works of renowned artists. Ronan stepped in behind her, his voice almost a whisper, saying, "This place has been in your name since you were 12, Delaney. My father purchased it through a private trust, managed by 3 independent lawyers, so Magnus could never trace it, and it has remained empty ever since, waiting for you to come home." Delaney said nothing, only moved through the living room, across an Italian-style kitchen lined with Carrara marble, then up to the 2nd level by an oak spiral staircase. Ronan stopped before a closed door at the end of the hallway and gently pushed it open. She stepped inside. The room took her breath away. A medium-sized bedroom arranged like the dream of a 7-year-old girl. A small white princess bed with 4 posts and soft sheer curtains, stuffed bears of all sizes arranged neatly, with one faded brown bear placed in the most honored position. A cream-colored bookshelf filled with classic children's stories, from Alice in Wonderland to Anne of Green Gables to Pippi Longstocking. A small desk with a star-shaped lamp. A round, pale blue rug shaped like a cloud beneath the bed. Everything had been preserved exactly as Finian had arranged it, covered in a thin layer of dust that was gently cleaned once each month by a loyal housekeeper. It was the room he had prepared for her when he could not bring her home, kept unchanged for 20 years, as a silent promise that one day she would return. Delaney walked slowly inside, her hands brushing across embroidered pillowcases, along the spines of books, through the soft fur of the brown bear. She stopped before a small white vanity near the window, where a silver-plated music box shaped like a butterfly resting on a flower sat waiting. She lifted the lid, and at that very moment, a melody filled the quiet room, familiar in a way that struck deep into her soul. The melody of Danny Boy, the old Irish song her father had once sung to her each night. A melody she had forgotten for 20 years, yet still carried somewhere in her bones. Memory surged back like a rising tide, the image of Declan holding her in a warm blue blanket, his voice low and gentle, as he sang beside her ear, the scent of his shaving lotion mingling with the lavender on her mother's clothes. Delaney sank to the wooden floor, clutching the music box to her chest, and she cried not from sorrow, but from the realization that in all her 27 years, she had never truly been alone as she had believed. As she held the music box tighter against her heart, a faint clicking sound came from within, as though something had shifted inside a hidden compartment, but in that moment she was too overwhelmed to notice such a small detail. The next 3 days passed for Delaney like a strange dream, half real and half imagined. She agreed to temporarily move into the penthouse in Back Bay at Ronan's request, for absolute safety after the attack on the 3rd night at the mansion. For the first 2 days, she hardly left the bedroom Finian had prepared for her, turning the pages of every children's book on the shelf, holding the faded brown teddy bear as she slept each night like a 7-year-old, reclaiming the childhood she never had. The butterfly-shaped music box sat carefully on her bedside table, and each night before sleep she would lift its lid and listen once to the melody of Danny Boy, letting it feel as though her father was singing softly beside her again. Ronan didn't ask anything of her during those days. He came each morning with breakfast from a small French bakery in North End that her father had once loved, a place Finian had written down in his notebook 2 decades earlier. He sat with her for about 30 minutes each morning, drinking coffee and speaking of simple things, the weather, the book she was reading, a stray cat he had begun feeding in the garden. On the morning of the 4th day, Ronan arrived with a more serious expression than usual. He told her that later that afternoon, there would be the regular council meeting of the Blackwood family, a gathering held once every quarter in the large room on the 1st floor of the mansion, attended by all senior members of the organization. He hadn't wanted her to appear so soon, but Magnus Voss had already sensed her presence and had personally requested to meet her at the meeting, under the pretense that the family should remain united during a sensitive time. If Ronan refused, it would raise suspicion and might trigger a conflict he wasn't yet prepared to face. Delaney took a deep breath and agreed. She knew that sooner or later she would have to face the man who had destroyed her family, and she wanted to see him with her own eyes. That afternoon, she wore a navy suit Ronan had prepared, her chestnut hair tied neatly at the nape, her mother's silver bracelet still around her left wrist, like a quiet protection. When she stepped into the great room of Blackwood Manor, 16 men in expensive suits sat around a 12-meter walnut table, and the entire room fell silent at the sight of her. Magnus Voss sat at the vice chair to the right of Ronan's empty seat. He was 57 years old, of average build, his shoulders slightly rounded with age. His thick salt and pepper hair was carefully combed back, revealing a broad forehead. His face was round and almost kind, with lightly flushed cheeks and a gentle smile, like that of a familiar figure in a church. He wore a finely tailored dark gray suit from Brioni, a moss-green silk tie, and on the little finger of his left hand was a gold ring engraved with a raven. At a glance, he looked more like a benevolent pastor than a man behind countless deaths. But when Delaney met his eyes, a chill ran through her spine. Those brown eyes held no warmth. They were murky like rainwater stirred with mud, completely empty beneath the smile on his lips. Magnus rose slowly, walked around the table with deliberate calm, and extended his hand toward her with a politeness so perfect it felt hollow. His voice, sweet as honey laced with something bitter, broke the silence of the room, saying, "My dear niece, I have searched for you for 20 years without success. My goodness, you look exactly like your mother. Those same eyes, that same face. Welcome home to the Blackwood family." Delaney had no choice but to take his hand, and when his cold fingers closed around hers, she felt a shiver run through her body. His hand held no warmth, no trace of life, like touching the skin of a snake. Before she could respond, Ronan stood from his chair, stepped forward, and placed himself between them with quiet precision. His smile was polite, but his dark blue eyes were cold as ice as they met Magnus's gaze. "Uncle Magnus, Miss Hartwell needs time to adjust after 20 years away. I will arrange a private dinner so you may speak with her more comfortably when the time is right." Magnus gave a light laugh and patted Ronan's shoulder in a gesture of false familiarity, saying, "Of course, my boy. But remember, in this family, blood always comes first. Nothing can divide us." After the meeting, which lasted exactly 40 minutes and of which Delaney remembered almost nothing, Ronan led her straight into his study on the 2nd floor, closed the door, and locked it. He turned to her, his face shadowed with concern, and said, "He already knows everything. Delaney, he didn't come to greet you. He came to measure you, to decide if you are a threat, and he will move sooner than I expected, starting tonight. You are not to go anywhere alone, not even onto the balcony. Harlan Cole will remain with you at all times, day and night, without exception." After that tense afternoon, Ronan suggested that Delaney stay at Blackwood Manor for the night instead of returning to the penthouse, explaining that the security team needed time to sweep the glass tower in Back Bay after detecting signs of surveillance from Magnus's people. Delaney agreed, and Arthur Whitmore prepared a small guest room for her on the 2nd floor, just 3 doors away from Ronan's study. But when the antique clock in the hall struck 2 o'clock in the morning, Delaney was still lying on the 4-post bed with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The image of Magnus's false smile, the memory of his hand cold as stone gripping hers, the murky emptiness in his eyes, all of it circled relentlessly in her mind. She sat up quietly, pulled on a thin gray sweater, and stepped out into the hallway. The entire mansion was silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock and the silver light of the moon spilling through the tall glass windows. She walked barefoot along the corridor, down the marble staircase, and as she passed the first-floor library, she noticed a warm golden light spilling through a slightly open door. Delaney pushed the door gently and paused at the threshold. Inside the vast library, with its towering walnut shelves, Ronan Blackwood sat in a brown leather armchair before a stone fireplace, the flames casting shifting shadows across his face. For the first time since she had known him, he wasn't dressed in a suit or a crisp white shirt. He wore a simple dark gray sweater, black trousers, and soft leather slippers. His dark hair, usually neat, fell loosely, and in his hand was a glass of whiskey nearly empty. In the firelight, Ronan Blackwood no longer looked like the most powerful Mafia boss in New England. He was simply a man of 34 years, carrying the weight of a legacy too heavy for one life, sitting alone in a house too large, surrounded by the quiet ghosts of his past. He looked up when he heard her, and his gaze softened slightly. He gestured for her to come in, pointing to the armchair across from him. Delaney sat, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. "Can't sleep." She shook her head. "Neither can I." Silence lingered for several minutes, broken only by the soft crackle of burning wood. Then Delaney asked the question that had been eating at her for 3 days since she learned the truth. "Why did you wait 6 years, Ronan? If you knew Magnus killed your father, why didn't you take revenge immediately?" Ronan didn't answer at once. He stared into the fire, slowly turning the empty glass in his hand. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Because of my father's final wish, Delaney, the night he was poisoned, with only 3 hours left to live, he called me to his bedside and spent his final hour writing a letter. In that letter, he told me something I have obeyed for 6 years. He wrote that I must act only when I have undeniable proof, enough for all 15 members of the family council to see Magnus's guilt without question. If I act too soon, the family will split into 2 sides, those loyal to Magnus and those loyal to me. A war will follow, and hundreds of innocent people will never see another dawn. Be patient, my son. Wait for the moment." Delaney fell silent. She had never imagined such a burden. "For 6 years, I have gathered every piece of secondary evidence, financial records, witness statements, photographs of secret meetings, but none of it is enough to bring him down before the council, because he has too many allies he has bought. I have always been missing one thing, one single thing my father believed existed. A red notebook your father, Declan, hid somewhere before he was killed. Inside that notebook is a list of high-ranking officials who took bribes from Magnus, with amounts, dates, and bank accounts. With that notebook, Magnus falls. Without it, I cannot act. For 6 years, I have hired 17 investigators to search every corner of Boston, from bank vaults to old churches, from your father's demolished house to the law offices he once used. Nothing. Until you appeared." Ronan reached to the small table beside him, picked up an old brown leather album, and handed it to Delaney. "This was made for you by my father. He left it with Arthur before he died." Delaney took it with trembling hands and opened the first page. Inside were photographs of her, along with carefully written lines in Finian's handwriting. She turned to the last page, and beneath a photograph of her reading in Boston Common, there was a short sentence written in black ink. "You are not only Declan's daughter. You are the heir to something we paid too much to protect. Use it wisely, my dear." Delaney closed the album, held it against her chest, then looked up at Ronan through tears. "If it were you, Ronan, what would you choose? Would you run, or would you stay and fight?" Ronan met her eyes in the firelight, and his voice did not waver for even a second. "Fight, Delaney. But this is not my war. This is yours, your father's, your mother's. I can stand beside you. But the one who must hold the weapon and claim justice is you. You must decide." Delaney fell asleep in the leather armchair in the library at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. Finian's album still clutched tightly in her arms, and Ronan had quietly draped a warm wool blanket over her before retreating to his own room. When she opened her eyes, the morning light had already filled the library through the tall windows, and Arthur Whitmore had placed a cup of hot coffee and a plate of croissants on the small table beside her. She glanced at the antique clock in the corner. It was nearly 9 o'clock. After washing her face and changing her clothes, Delaney found Ronan in the dining room, and told him she wanted to return to the penthouse alone that morning. She needed time to think, to process everything that had happened during the night. Ronan hesitated for a moment, but agreed on the condition that Harlan Cole would drive her and remain outside the penthouse the entire time. Delaney accepted. The Rolls-Royce brought her back to the glass tower in Back Bay at 10 o'clock. Harlan Cole took his seat quietly in the private hallway outside the penthouse, as still and watchful as a shadow. Delaney locked the door behind her, leaned her back against the walnut wood, and drew in a deep breath. The silence of the 3-level apartment wrapped around her gently. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls, reflecting off the Charles River in shimmering patterns. She went straight to the second floor, to the bedroom Finian had prepared for a 7-year-old girl. She sat down on the wooden floor in front of the vanity and lifted the silver butterfly music box into her lap. She needed to hear Danny Boy again. She needed her father beside her, even if only through a song 20 years old. Delaney opened the lid. The familiar melody filled the room, soft and aching. She closed her eyes, pressing the music box to her chest, letting each note sink deep into her bones. But this time, as she turned the box slowly in her hands to study the delicate engravings, her finger pressed unknowingly on a small hidden point beneath the base, just under the left wing of the butterfly. A faint click sounded, and she stared in astonishment as a hidden compartment, about 2 centimeters thick, slid open from beneath the music box, like a tiny drawer. Her heart began to race. She set the box on the floor, her hands trembling as she looked inside. Lined with faded red velvet, lay 2 small objects placed side by side. A folded piece of paper, pressed so many times it had become thick and square, and a small metal key, about 4 centimeters long, its brass surface dulled by time, with 4 numbers engraved on its head in raised detail. 1987. Delaney picked up the key first, letting it rest across her palm. It was light as a feather, yet it felt heavy in her soul. She set it aside and lifted the paper with trembling fingers. As she unfolded each crease, elegant feminine handwriting appeared, written on high-quality stationery from the early 2000s, now yellowed at the edges. It was a handwriting she had never seen before, yet from the very first word she knew it belonged to her mother, Isabel Hartwell. Delaney read through tears. "My beloved daughter, if one day you find this letter and the key beside it, it means your father and I are no longer with you. I ask your forgiveness for leaving you alone in this world. We had no choice, my child. There is someone who threatens our family, and we must do everything to protect you. This key leads to First Boston Bank on Franklin Street, safety deposit box 1987. Inside that box is everything your father and I spent the last 2 years of our lives gathering, and it is the only thing that can bring justice for us. I believe you will find this letter one day, because I believe your father's brother, the man named Finian, will find you and bring you home. Trust him, my daughter. Be strong as I have been strong. Live a life worthy of the love we have left you. I love you more than my life, Delaney. Your mother, Isabel Hartwell." Delaney sat motionless on the wooden floor, the letter trembling in her hands, tears falling onto its fragile folds. She had not known her mother for 27 years, and now, at 27, she was reading the first and perhaps only words her mother had ever written to her. She cried in silence for an uncounted stretch of time, until the weight of emotion softened, and she remembered the true meaning of what she had just found. She wiped her tears quickly with the sleeve of her sweater, picked up the phone Ronan had given her, and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense with concern. Delaney could only manage one broken sentence. "Can you come now? I found something." 25 minutes later, the penthouse door opened, and Ronan stepped inside, his expression tight with urgency. Delaney stood in the center of the living room, the small brass key resting in her palm, the letter held in her other hand like a treasure. When Ronan saw the key with its engraved numbers, his entire expression changed in a way she had never seen before. The cold composure of a crime lord vanished, replaced by something it took her a moment to recognize: hope. He stepped closer, his dark blue eyes fixed on the key, his voice rough with emotion. "Delaney, this is what my father has been searching for 6 years. This is what I hired 17 investigators to find across Boston without success. Your father hid the list of officials who took bribes from Magnus in safety deposit box 1987 at First Boston Bank. Without it, Magnus walks free. With it, his entire empire collapses in a single night." Ronan did not waste a single minute. He took out his phone, made a brief call to Harlan Cole waiting outside the hallway, then contacted a private lawyer named Nathaniel Pritchard, the man who had represented the Blackwood family for more than 3 decades. Within 40 minutes, every necessary document was prepared, and the black Rolls-Royce carried Ronan and Delaney away from the glass tower in Back Bay. Harlan Cole sat in the front seat beside the driver, his hand always near the weapon hidden beneath his jacket, his eyes scanning the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The car moved through the crowded streets of Boston in the early afternoon and stopped in front of the First Boston Bank building on Franklin Street, an old granite structure built in the year 1884, its facade styled in Greek architecture, with 2 massive stone columns guarding the entrance. Nathaniel Pritchard, a tall, thin man about 65 years old, with neatly combed silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses, was already waiting in the main lobby alongside the branch director. Under the guidance of Harlan and Nathaniel, Delaney and Ronan passed through 2 layers of heavy steel security doors, descended 2 levels by private elevator, and finally reached the vault room deep underground. The chamber was enclosed by concrete walls 1 meter thick, lined with thousands of safety deposit boxes arranged in precise order. After verifying Delaney's legal inheritance as the rightful heir of Isabel Hartwell, the branch director led them to box number 1987 and withdrew discreetly, leaving the family alone. Delaney stood before the dual lock, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She inserted the small brass key into the right lock, while Nathaniel used the master key in the left. 2 clicks sounded at the same time, and the small vault door slowly opened. Delaney drew in a deep breath and pulled the metal drawer, about 50 centimeters long, from the wall. Inside, resting on faded black velvet, were 2 items placed side by side. A red leather notebook about 4 centimeters thick, the size of a school textbook, its spine bound with gold thread and its cover embossed with a small owl crest. Beside it lay a thick cream envelope, sealed with red wax bearing the intertwined initials D and I. On the front, in strong masculine handwriting, were 3 words: "For my beloved Delaney." Delaney picked up the envelope first and pressed it against her chest for a few seconds, as if trying to feel the echo of the father who had written it 20 years before. Then she lifted the red notebook, holding both treasures close as she followed Ronan out of the vault. No one spoke as they returned to the elevator, crossed the bank lobby, and stepped back into the waiting Rolls-Royce. As the car left Franklin Street and moved slowly along the Charles River toward Blackwood Manor, Ronan sat beside her in the back seat, while Harlan remained in front at a respectful distance. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over Delaney's chestnut hair. She slowly broke the red wax seal, drew out the letter, and unfolded the pages marked by time. Her father's handwriting appeared before her, steady and precise, the hand of a man who had spent his life among numbers that never lied. Delaney took a breath and began to read. "My dearest Delaney, if you are reading these words, it means I am no longer by your side. I am sorry, my little girl, sorry that you had to grow up alone in this world. I want you to understand one thing above all else. Your mother and I did not choose to leave you. You were taken from us, and we did not have the time, nor the strength, to fight back. I spent the last 2 years of my life gathering everything in this red notebook. Every name, every number, every date, every bank account. This is the weapon I leave to you, so that you may claim justice for your mother, and for me. Trust Finian, my daughter. He is the best brother I have ever known, and I know that even in my absence, he would never abandon you. Trust yourself as well, Delaney. You carry the blood of your mother, Isabel Hartwell, the bravest woman I have ever known. You will succeed. You will do what we could not. I love you, my daughter, forever and always. Your father, Declan Hartwell." Tears fell silently onto the page, blurring the final signature. Delaney did not sob aloud. She simply wept in silence, each tear slipping down her cheek and soaking into the fabric of her sweater. Beside her, Ronan said nothing. He only reached over slowly and placed his hand gently over her trembling one. His touch was warm, steady, and sincere. It was a simple gesture without words. Yet for Delaney, it was the first time in 27 years that she truly felt she was no longer alone. She leaned slightly toward him, resting her head against his shoulder for a brief moment, then lifted herself again and wiped her tears with the back of her hand. When the Rolls-Royce stopped before the 4-meter iron gates of Blackwood Manor, Delaney tightened her grip on the red notebook, her voice clear and resolute. We finish this, Ronan. Tonight. Ronan did not waste a single second the moment the Rolls-Royce entered the courtyard of the mansion. He led Delaney straight to his study on the second floor, closed the door, and took out a specially encrypted phone from his desk drawer, a device he used only for the most critical calls of his life, calls that no one, not even his own security team, was allowed to intercept. He dialed a number he had memorized for 6 years but had never once called. Delaney sat quietly in the leather chair across from him, the red notebook resting before her like a sacred object, her eyes following his every movement. Ronan stood by the window, his back to her, waiting for the call to be answered. After 4 rings, someone picked up. Ronan spoke exactly 6 words in a low, steady voice. "It is time, Your Honor." Then he listened in silence for nearly 2 minutes, nodding once or twice, before saying, 8 o'clock tonight, Blackwood Manor, thank you. He ended the call and turned back to her, his voice noticeably lighter, saying he has agreed to come. Delaney frowned slightly and asked, "Who is he?" Ronan sat down across from her and placed the phone on the desk, saying, "Judge Thaddeus Crane, 68 years old, retired from the Massachusetts Federal Court 3 years ago, an old friend of my father from 40 years ago, from the days when both our fathers first arrived in Boston. He is the only man in the state legal system my father ever trusted completely. He has iron principles, and in 30 years on the bench, he has never once been bought, even when the bribes reached 7 figures. If there is anyone in this world who can bring Magnus Voss to justice without the case being buried, it is Judge Crane. I did not contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly because Magnus has planted spies deep within several federal agencies in the Boston area. If I make a direct call, the information will reach him within 24 hours. But Judge Crane can move through a different channel, through a senior agent in Washington he has known for more than 20 years, someone whose identity is unknown to anyone in Boston. That is the only safe path." Delaney nodded, understanding. When the antique clock in the hall struck 8 o'clock that evening, the iron gates of Blackwood Manor opened to admit an old black Lincoln Town car. The vehicle stopped at the main entrance, and a tall, thin man stepped out slowly, his posture still straight, like a man who had spent 3 decades seated on the bench. Judge Thaddeus Crane stood about 1.80 meters tall, lean but firm, his silver hair combed neatly back. He wore a dark gray tweed suit in the classic style of New England intellectuals, and carried a worn brown leather briefcase. What stood out most were his eyes, sharp gray blue eyes like a blade, the eyes of a man who had seen the darkest parts of humanity and still held firm to justice. Arthur Whitmore led him into the study. When the door opened and Judge Crane stepped inside, his gaze immediately settled on Delaney. He stood still for several seconds, then approached her slowly, looking into her gray-blue eyes with an expression she could not fully read. Then he spoke, his voice deep and rough, saying, "You resemble Isabel exactly, young lady. The same eyes, the same direct gaze, the same strength in your jaw. Your mother could have changed this entire city if she had not been taken too soon. She and I spoke for the last time 3 days before that tragic night. She called me to ask for advice about where to deliver the evidence. I told her to be careful, to wait a few more weeks. I was not forceful enough. That is something I will carry to my grave." Delaney could not speak. She simply rose and shook his hand. His hand was warm and firm, nothing like the cold, lifeless touch of Magnus. Judge Crane sat in the armchair near the fireplace, took out a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses, and Ronan placed the red notebook before him. For 2 hours straight, the judge turned each page, reading every line, occasionally underlining with a pencil, occasionally pausing to draw a deep breath. His expression grew heavier with each page, the lines on his forehead deepening. Ronan and Delaney sat in silence, not daring to interrupt. When he finally closed the notebook and removed his glasses, his face had completely changed. "This is evidence of the century, in the truest sense. Declan did extraordinary work. 4 state judges, 11 high-ranking police officers, 3 Boston City officials, every bribe recorded with amounts, dates, bank accounts, even meeting locations. No lawyer in the world could deny evidence like this. It is enough to dismantle the entire network Magnus has built over 20 years, and enough to ensure he never walks free again." He turned to Ronan, his gaze firm, saying, "I will contact Agent Hutchinson in the Federal Bureau of Investigation Washington office tonight. But you must accept 2 conditions, and they are not negotiable. First, the Blackwood family must transition all operations to legitimate business within 6 months of Magnus's arrest. All remaining underground activity must end. Second, you must cooperate fully with the federal investigation, providing all necessary information in exchange for immunity regarding past operations involving you and your father. Ronan did not hesitate. He stood and extended his hand, saying agreed, "Your Honor, all of it." Judge Crane nodded, stood, and shook his hand firmly, saying, "Then tonight, we will show Magnus Voss the price of betrayal." He opened his briefcase once more, took out an old military-style satellite phone, and began dialing. The next day became the longest day of Delaney's life. She stood beside Ronan in his study that morning as he called each member of the Blackwood Council, inviting them to a formal dinner at 8 o'clock that evening at the mansion, under the official pretense of introducing the Hartwell heir back into the family. Magnus Voss was the first to receive the call, and Ronan deliberately softened his tone as he invited him, a subtle signal that he had accepted Magnus's presence. Magnus laughed warmly through the phone, agreed without hesitation, and even suggested bringing a bottle of wine he had preserved for 20 years to celebrate the reunion. Throughout the afternoon, Delaney remained inside the locked third-floor room, reading again every letter Finian had written, looking once more at every photograph on the walls, strengthening her resolve. At 6 o'clock, Gabiran came to her with a black rectangular box in his hands. Inside was a simple yet elegant black silk evening dress, modestly cut to cover the shoulders, paired with low heels and a pair of pearl earrings. "This belonged to your mother," Ronan said softly. "My father kept it for 20 years. Today is the right day for you to wear it." Delaney accepted the box with trembling hands, unable to speak. At 7:45 that evening, she descended the marble staircase, the black silk dress flowing gently with each step, her chestnut hair styled neatly in a classic French knot, her mother's silver bracelet still resting on her left wrist. The long ebony dining table, exactly 8 meters in length, had been set with exquisite precision by Arthur Whitmore and the staff, with antique Wedgwood china, delicate baccarat glasses, silver cutlery engraved with the raven crest, and 14 tall beeswax candles burning in polished holders. 13 guests had arrived on time, seated in expensive suits, their faces marked by curiosity. Ronan sat at the head of the table, Delaney to his right. The vice chair opposite him was reserved for Magnus Voss, who arrived exactly at 8 o'clock, accompanied by 4 bodyguards waiting in the hallway. Magnus wore a tailored black suit with a vivid red tie, holding a bottle of Chateau Margaux from 1985 wrapped in gold paper. He entered with a wide smile, greeted each guest, embraced Ronan like a familiar uncle, and bowed slightly to Delaney with polite congratulations. Beneath the table beside Ronan's chair, Kaiser, the large black Doberman, lay still, ears alert, eyes fixed on Magnus without a single moment of distraction. When the appetizers were cleared, Ronan placed his napkin down and rose slowly. The room fell completely silent. He lifted his glass, his gaze sweeping across every face. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I would like to share a story that has lasted 20 years, and tonight it finally reaches its end." He set the glass down, reached inside his jacket, and placed the thick red notebook onto the table with a sharp sound that echoed through the room. In that instant, Magnus's face paled for a fraction of a second, the color draining before he regained his composure and took a slow sip of wine. Ronan opened the notebook to the first page. December 2003. State Judge Henry Wallace, $250,000. Cayman account, 4792. He turned the page. March 2005. Deputy Chief Justice Margaret Thornton, $400,000. Transferred through shell company Pinehurst Holdings. Another page. July 2004. Colonel Bradford Hill of the Boston Police, $320,000. Cash delivered at the Ritz. Each name Ronan spoke struck Magnus like a blade. His hands rested on the table, his knuckles gradually turning white. By the 8th name, City Councilman Robert Channing, $210,000. Magnus suddenly rose from his chair. His right hand moved swiftly inside his jacket, reaching for something metallic, but he was too late. Kaiser, who had waited the entire evening, launched forward like a bolt of black lightning, blocking his path with a deep, threatening growl. Teeth bared. Magnus froze, his hand already gripping the hidden object but unable to draw it. At the same moment, from the 4 corners of the room, 6 of Ronan's security men who had blended in as staff moved instantly. Magnus's 4 bodyguards in the hallway were subdued within seconds, while inside, 2 guards restrained Magnus, forcing his arms behind his back and disarming him. The entire scene unfolded in less than 10 seconds, without chaos, without a single raised voice. Ronan remained standing, looking directly into Magnus Voss's dull brown eyes, his voice cold as forged steel. 20 years ago, you betrayed my father, the man who treated you as a brother. You destroyed the Hartwell family to hide your crimes. 6 years ago, you ordered my father's death when he began to suspect you. And tonight, Magnus Voss, is the night you answer for everything. Magnus Voss stood there with his hands restrained behind his back by 2 security men, his black suit disheveled, his red tie loosened and askew. Yet, strangely, he showed no fear, only a dry, faint smile, even as his face had turned pale beneath the beeswax candlelight. He lifted his head and looked directly into Ronan's dark blue eyes, his voice still carrying its familiar arrogance, asking, "What will you do next, my boy? Kill me right here at this table. Do you think you have the strength your father had? You have forgotten the most important thing, Ronan. I still have 7 council members loyal to me sitting at this very table. If you strike me tonight, tomorrow the Blackwood family will split in 2, and before summer arrives, you will be burying half the men seated here. Your father knew that, which is why he waited 14 years without daring to move against me. You do not have that strength, my boy." Ronan did not answer at once. He slowly turned his head to the left, looking at Delaney, and in that look, she understood that the final decision had been placed in her hands. This was not his war. It was hers, just as he had told her the night before in the library. Delaney set her napkin down and rose from her seat, her mother's black silk dress falling like a dark stream around her feet. She walked slowly around the head of the table, her low heels echoing softly against the marble floor, and stopped directly in front of Magnus at a distance of 1 meter. She stood straight, shoulders steady, her gray-blue eyes shining beneath the candlelight, the very image of Isabel Hartwell in the photographs Judge Crane had once seen. The 13 council members seated around the table held their breath. "No," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying through the silent room like the toll of a bell. "He will not do that, Mr. Voss. Not because he cannot, but because I will not allow it. I have made my decision." Magnus frowned, his murky brown eyes scanning her face with undisguised surprise. Delaney did not break her gaze. "My mother, Isabel Hartwell, was an investigative journalist. She believed in the justice of the law above all else. She spent the final 2 years of her life gathering evidence the right way, so that you would face a court of law, not fall in the shadows the way you destroyed her. If I choose violence tonight, I betray everything she believed in and died for, and that is something I will never do. You do not deserve a quick death in the dark, Mr. Voss. You deserve 30 years in a small cell, waking every day to ask yourself what you lost everything for. That is real justice, the justice my mother wanted for you." At that very moment, the great doors of the dining hall opened with a sharp sound. Judge Thaddeus Crane entered first, followed by 12 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents in black jackets marked with gold lettering, all part of a special unit he had brought in from Washington, none of them from Boston. Leading them was Agent Hutchinson, a woman around 50 years old, with short blonde hair and a stern expression, holding a federal arrest warrant. The 13 council members froze in their seats, no one daring to move. When Magnus saw her, the last trace of arrogance vanished from his face, replaced by genuine panic. She cuffed him on the spot, read him his rights under the 5th Amendment, and 2 agents escorted him out of the dining room in complete shock. In the weeks that followed, the case exploded across every major newspaper in New England. The prosecution of Magnus Voss became the most significant corruption trial in modern Boston history. 4 state judges, 11 high-ranking police officers, and 3 city officials were arrested based on the evidence from Delaney Hartwell's Red Notebook. After a trial lasting 14 months, despite the most expensive defense attorneys he could hire, Magnus Voss was sentenced to 30 years without parole in a maximum security federal prison in Colorado. Under Ronan's leadership, the Blackwood family began its transformation under Judge Crane's strict supervision. Within 6 months, all underground operations were shut down, and the empire was rebuilt into a legitimate corporation focused on high-end real estate, 4-star hotels, venture investment, and philanthropy. Delaney, with a $20 million inheritance from the trust Finian had established for her 15 years earlier, founded the Hartwell Blackwood Foundation, a nonprofit organization supporting orphans and victims of domestic abuse across New England. Arthur Whitmore, The old steward who had carried the family's secrets for 20 years passed away peacefully in his sleep on an early spring night, 3 months after Magnus's sentencing. At his funeral at St. Patrick Church in North End, Delaney placed a single white rose upon his coffin and whispered her final thanks. He had lived long enough to see her return home, just as he had promised Finian 20 years before, and he left this world with a heart finally at peace.